The crucifixion is a strange and bitter crop. Let's be real about something. All throughout Lent, we've been taking a hard look at our mortality. We've been looking at it through the lens of the hospice process, how finite our time here is, and how best to number our days and to fill them. And it's already been a fairly morbid process, but we've been primarily considering the image of a hospital deathbed. Soft last breaths, surrounded by family and friends. But the cross is not a peaceful departure. I can't stand here on Good Friday and not name that there is a difference. Sometimes death is this bad. In the face of modern-day warfare, ongoing hunger, systemic oppression, and the reality of nearly 1 billion people living without clean water, we need to draw our attention to the violent, jarring, awful realities about the death of Jesus. The crucifixion, like other traumas, is a moment that denies us the pieces to even put the pieces back together again. Those who study war, violence, PTSD, abuse have found that trauma is not only an emotional and a mental phenomenon, it is a deeply physiological experience. Those in the midst of trauma experience a disruption of time and place. Hours become minutes, and minutes drag into days. Time seems to come to a halt. All our usual understandings of identity shift. Who we are, where we are, what our relationships are or ought to be. And when we encounter circumstances that we cannot control, we feel powerless and insecure. It silences our particular voice. It makes us question our truths and doubt whether we were ever the master of our own fate. And this affront to our absolutes, to the structures on which we deny, to the ways that we know what we know, disrupts most fundamentally our ability to make meaning of our lives. People who have gone through trauma struggle to integrate what they've witnessed or been the victim of with their understanding of the world. Trauma robs us of our capacity to imagine the future and to remember the past. On a neurological level, violence affects a person's ability to know, to act, to remember, and to love. Only with time and perhaps the help of supportive people and a community of love can we cultivate again our sense of safety, agency, and creativity again. The cross disrupts reality. It splits the veil and blows open the human condition. It names us both victim and villain. It calls us to confront our desire to escape suffering, to cheapen death with the promise of one final magic trick. It forces us to come face to face with hell. The cross, too, deserves to be meaningless. We owe it to ourselves to sit with the senselessness of its violence, and we owe it to the crucified people of the world to sit in Holy Saturday. Shelley Rambo is a theologian I've worked with who's done a lot of work around theology and trauma, where God is in disorienting, life-shattering experiences. And she brought my attention to the way that Christians tend to rush the resurrection story. Oh, things are bad in your life? No worries, Easter's on the way. You're going through something? Well, just hold on for that silver lining. Not only is this the source of our most toxic theology, it's the same voice that speaks to our most devastating tragedies in that disconnected tone. I know it hurts, but there's a reason for everything. Or to the grieving parent, God needed another angel in heaven. But it's also true that when we skip from Good Friday to Easter because the cross makes us uncomfortable, we miss the reality that some people spend their entire lives in some form of hell. We owe it to those who have been given their terminal diagnosis or who are sitting steeped in Holy Saturday at the bedside of someone who has. We owe it to the people who are literally dying for their next fix, for the wrongfully and the rightfully imprisoned, conveniently tucked away in a massive prison industrial complex that we don't want to look at. For the women whose mothers who have taught them to always hide $10 or $20 from the grocery budget in case they have to get out. For the Syrian children whose murders we care enough about to retaliate against, but not enough to prevent. For those who are no longer afraid of dying, but of living with their depression, their compulsions, and their loneliness for one more empty day. In 2,000 years, I think we've become too familiar with the cross. We primarily see it plated in gold on the wall above the candles. We see it on T-shirts. We wear it around our necks on a silver chain. We have come to see the cross as beautiful, but not as it ought to be. Terribly beautiful. James Cone, in his incredible work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, calls us to see the cross for what it really is, an instrument of torture and death. Growing up as a young black man in Arkansas in the 1940s with Jim Crow laws as a constant reminder of his second-class citizenship and the ever-present threat of violence at the hands of white supremacy and white power structures, for him, coming to understand the cross meant seeing in its place the lynching tree, the cross of his context. We too often picture the cross triumphant, the cross through the lens of Easter, the cross but with Sunday on the way. Instead of the gilded cross on the marble altar, we ought to see the lynching tree. We ought to see Matthew Shepard on the fence. We ought to look at the cross and see 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles and an electric chair. Though I think that 40 days of preparation and intention can help us come to the cross with a renewed mind, in the end, this is the most elusive part of the gospel. The truth is that there are a lot of helpful, beautiful, compelling ways of thinking about what the crucifixion meant for the course of human history. And there are a lot of harmful ones too. The cross demands that we sit with questions. 40 days or a lifetime is not long enough to prepare. Yet one thing I feel fairly certain that we can take away from it is that Jesus is with those who suffer. He spent time with the lepers and outcasts in his life, and perhaps even more in his death. Jesus shows us that he knows something about pain and betrayal. We joke all the time at Collective that Lent is our Christmas, which seems a little off, doesn't it? Christmas in our culture is a time of joy, consumption, lights, presents, friends, and family. Christmas is concerned with the arrival of hope, of the fullness of life arriving in the form of a baby in a manger, the fullest incarnation of flesh, alive and new. Lent could not be more opposite in common practice. Lent is dark. It's morbid. If it is recognized at all, Lent is a time of penitence and the denial of the body and the flesh. Lent finds us alone in the desert confronting temptation. Lent finds us approaching our end, face to face with mortality, specifically with the reality of a violent death on the cross at the hands of empire. In most religious settings, Lent makes for really terrible marketing. Nobody wants to talk about death, and nobody wants to walk in the darkness. So what is the attraction for us? Chances are, if you've come to Collective, as many of us have, after trying unsuccessfully to find a home in some other Christian community, it's probably because that was a setting that preferred a convenient God, a baby in a manger and a Santa Claus in the sky. And perhaps if you find yourself here instead, it is because those easy answers were not sufficient to address the real suffering that you see and experience. Your doubts were not welcomed, ultimate concerns were overlooked and swept under the rug. But we celebrate uncomfortable holy days here. The hard questions are finally explored. They are not covered up or dismissed. We wrestle with violence, suffering, evil, and death, regardless of our ability to give answer to them. And in so doing, we find that we are not alone. Lent at Collective has become Christmas for those of us who have found others to sit in the darkness with. Yet this solidarity we've found, this paradox of faith, is not counter to the tradition. It is the heart of the Christian story that started in the little town of Bethlehem, a story that is incomplete without the cross, without, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because Jesus is not fully human until he dies, and Jesus is not fully human until he doubts. And we are not fully human unless we too die, and we are not fully alive when we deny that painful reality. We are mortal, impermanent, and imperfect, and we are filled with unanswerable questions and with gaping holes in our hearts, but we are never, never alone. Merry Christmas.
Kester Bruin writes, all of us who come to the table will one day become a part of the meal. All of us who come to the table will one day become a part of the meal. As we come to this table, especially on Good Friday, in the same way we don't dare rush crucifixion to resurrection, we need to be careful not to rush past death to memory. When Jesus asks his followers to remember him, we tend to think of memory in the same way we think of the cross. Memory as gilded and triumphal, rather than memory as the lynching tree. But here, Jesus' invitation to remember follows his rehearsal of death, of body separated from blood. Here is my body. Here is my blood. He will be killed, dismembered, his body separated from blood, his corporeal, singular human life extinguished from the earth. And in the aftermath of this, he invites his followers, those who come after him, to remember what has been dismembered. To remember what has been dismembered, to embody once again this life of love, sacrifice, wisdom and kindness, prophecy and hope, healing and political subversion. He invites us in memory to remember, to become members again of the body of a crucified innocent who has good news for the world. All of us who come to the table will one day become a part of the meal. It is only when we accept this invitation to become members of this crucified one that we get to hope for resurrection. It is to this bloody table of treacherous hope and terribly beautiful good news that we are invited. This is the table that has been set for us tonight. It is open to us and to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.